Daniel Mercer was the kind of man who believed in showing up. Not in the flashy, loud way, not with grand gestures or expensive dinners, but in the quiet, unglamorous way that actually holds a life together. He showed up to work at 6 a.m. every morning at the construction site, hard hat already on his head before the foreman arrived. He showed up on their anniversary with his wife's favorite flowers, not because a reminder told him to, but because he remembered. He showed up to every obligation, every commitment, every promise he ever made without exception. He and Sandra had been married for 6 years. They had met at a mutual friend's birthday party. She was laughing at something across the room, and Daniel had stood there for a full minute just watching her, convinced he was looking at someone he needed to know. He was right. Within 8 months, they were engaged. Within a year, they were married in a small outdoor ceremony with 60 guests and a cake that was slightly lopsided because the bakery had mixed up the order. They had laughed about it. That was the thing about the early years. They laughed about everything. They lived in a modest but comfortable house in a quiet suburb. Daniel had purchased it before the wedding, putting in every spare dollar he had saved since he was 22. It wasn't grand. 3 bedrooms, a small fireplace in the living room, a backyard with a garden that Sandra had initially promised to tend but had slowly abandoned. Daniel didn't complain. He mowed the lawn on weekends. He fixed what broke. He paid every bill on time. Sandra did not work. This had been a mutual agreement in the early years, or at least that was how Daniel had understood it. The plan had been that she would manage the home, and perhaps eventually they would start a family. The family part never materialized. Sandra was not interested yet, she said. Daniel accepted that. He was patient by nature. He had learned patience from his father, a man who had worked 30 years in a steel mill and never once raised his voice in anger. What Daniel did not know, what he had never allowed himself to seriously suspect, was that Sandra's days were not entirely spent on domestic routine. She had reconnected with a former colleague named Ryan about 2 years into the marriage. Ryan was her former supervisor from the marketing firm she had briefly worked at before quitting. He was charming in the way that men who know they are charming tend to be: polished, well-dressed, comfortable in his own skin in a way that felt slightly performative once you looked closely enough. But Daniel never looked closely at Ryan because Daniel trusted his wife. The lunches with Ryan became regular. The lunches became afternoons. The afternoons became hotel rooms. Sandra told herself it wasn't serious. She told herself it was just something she needed, something Daniel couldn't give her: excitement, spontaneity, the feeling of being wanted in a certain electric way. She was skilled at the kind of self-justification that unfaithful people develop, detailed, internally consistent, emotionally flattering to the person doing it. Daniel noticed nothing. He came home tired most evenings. They ate dinner together. They watched television. He asked about her day. She gave him answers that were technically true and fundamentally dishonest. She was a good liar, which is to say she had practiced enough to no longer feel like one. Daniel's brother Mike lived in Hargrove, the next town over, about 40 minutes away. Mike was 2 years older, broader in the shoulders, and had inherited their father's bluntness along with his patience. He worked as a project manager for a logistics company and was married to a woman named Carol, with whom he had 2 sons. Mike had never fully warmed to Sandra, though he had never been able to articulate precisely why. He had once told Carol privately that Sandra had the eyes of someone always calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Carol had told him he was being unfair. He had agreed and dropped it. Mike and Daniel spoke on the phone twice a week. They met in person at least once a month for dinner, rotating between their 2 houses. It was the kind of brotherly relationship built not on sentimentality, but on reliability. They simply showed up for each other, consistently, without drama. This was the life Daniel Mercer had built, ordinary in all the ways that actually count. He was 34 years old, healthy, careful, and completely unaware of what was coming. The accident happened on a Tuesday. A structural beam at the construction site shifted during a routine lift. The chain securing it had been improperly inspected, a fact that would later become the subject of both an internal inquiry and a lawsuit. The beam swung and caught Daniel across the right side of his torso and head. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. He was airlifted to St. Raymond's Medical Center. Internal bleeding, TH. Re-fractured ribs, a collapsed lung, and a severe concussion. He was placed in the ICU. For the first 36 hours, the doctors were not entirely certain which way it would go. Sandra was contacted immediately. She arrived at the hospital with red eyes and shaking hands, which the nurses noted. She sat by his bed and held his hand and said the things that people in her position say. The doctors updated her carefully. She nodded. She wept. She accepted the comfort of the nursing staff with appropriate gratitude. Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness. When he surfaced, he saw her face and felt a wave of something he took for love and security. She was there. That was what mattered. He went back under. What he did not see was what happened during the hours he was unconscious. On the third day of his hospitalization, a nurse named Yvonne was completing her afternoon rounds when she passed the small family waiting area adjacent to Daniel's room. The door was half open. She glanced in out of habit and stopped. Sandra was in the waiting room with a man. Not a family member, not a friend offering comfort in a moment of crisis. The body language told Yvonne everything she needed to know in under 2 seconds, the intimacy of proximity, the way the man's hand moved along Sandra's back, the way Sandra tipped her head back slightly when he leaned in. They were kissing, not the desperate, grief-stricken kiss of two people terrified of loss. The comfortable, practiced kiss of two people who had done this many times before. Yvonne stepped back from the doorway. She finished her rounds. She went home that evening and thought about what she had seen. She had been a nurse for 11 years. She had seen the families of patients do extraordinary things, extraordinary acts of love, and extraordinary acts of cruelty. What she had witnessed sat in her chest like something heavy.